to another Interpreter Roundtable. This is our Scripture Roundtable number 88, covering the Old Testament Gospel Doctrine lesson number 38, which is entitled, Beside Me There Is No Saviour. This lesson will cover Isaiah chapter 40 through 49. Our participants today are Martin Tanner, Shon Hopkin, Bruce Webster, and I am Andrew Smith. Now, the intent of this lesson from the manual is to help class members and church members to better understand that Jesus Christ is incomparable in his devotion to his people and that he has a great work for them to do. Isaiah contains some pretty interesting stuff and has some very important verses. And in fact, we're commanded in a number of places to take seriously the words of Isaiah. So hopefully today we can take some of these things seriously and have a few interesting comments or thoughts to share with you. As always, though, the caveat is we will not come anywhere near touching on everything. So if you do have other things that you'd like to share, we'd love to hear about them and the notes on the webpage where this is placed up. But also, don't get angry at us if we don't touch every single verse. So let's go ahead and get started. Martin, if you want to give us a little bit of an introduction to Isaiah ben Amoz.
Would be happy to do that. Isaiah is, as you mentioned, the prophet, probably, of the Book of Mormon that we are recommended to read far more than any other. Isaiah was a guy who lived 2,700 years ago. He lived a long, long time ago. And so his words must have been very, very, very important to the Jews for them to have not only recorded his words at a time when there were no printing presses or other significant means of publishing things like we have today, but also because they are mentioned in so many other locations. Isaiah, of course, has a very prominent place in the Bible, and he has this incredible style. He has his words have been described by many scholars, not just of the Bible, but of English, as some of the most profound and well-written as any words anywhere. His words are of hope. They are also very much of despair in different places. His name, Isaiah, literally means Yahweh or Jehovah is salvation, and so his very name talks about the message that he has. The book of Isaiah is, by scholars, traditionally divided into three parts. The first 39 verses are almost indisputably the words of Isaiah himself, although they've certainly been edited. And then chapters 40 through 55 are seen by some to be the words of someone else, or possibly the edited words of Isaiah, and the same with what's often called Third Isaiah, chapters 56 through 66. Interestingly enough, the scholarship on this is sort of collapsing back to where it started from, and there are many who see, even if the chapters from 40 on have been edited by others, they see in them the words of Isaiah himself. So these are chapters that we as Latter-day Saints can see as the very words of Isaiah, even if edited somewhat by others. Isaiah was someone who warned Israel to return to their God, and he prophesied in the 8th century BC in the kingdom of Judah, and his message was for both Judah and Israel. He was very outspoken. He had ties to the court, the royal court, and his message is quite dramatic. If you want to see some of his poetic style, get one of the new common English or ordinary English versions of the Bible, the New Revised Standard Version, the Contemporary English Version, even the Good News Bible, and you can see the verses divvied up or arranged in a way that shows Isaiah's poetic style, which is kind of a wonderful thing to do. With that short little intro, I'll turn the time back to you.
Oh, that's great, Martin. Thank you so much for setting the stage kind of for us. Now, for all of us reading Isaiah generally today, it can be somewhat of a daunting task. And I think, especially for members of the church, this is largely because we are so far removed from Isaiah, and we don't especially understand where he's coming from or what he's doing, because we're so far removed culturally and contextually from where he is and what he was dealing with. So it can be very helpful to turn to a lot of other sources to help us be able to understand Isaiah, and helping to understand particularly the types of speech and his poetics and the imagery that he used. All of these things can be foreign to us, so it can be helpful to get, as Martin mentioned, these newer translations that tend to put the poetry forward in a way that can at least be somewhat understood by us. But it can also be helpful to go out and get some commentaries that describe the way that Isaiah used, particularly parallelism and other types of imagery and things that work for us. Now, another help that we've been given is Nephi gives some specific words about understanding Isaiah. As we know from the Book of Mormon, Nephi and his brother Jacob quote Isaiah quite a bit. They're somewhat enamored with him. He presents some important things for their message that they give to us in the Book of Mormon. And in 2 Nephi 25, Nephi pushes out there 4 things that he holds to be generally vital to help us in understanding Isaiah. The first is understanding the manner of prophesying of the Jews. This would include their discussions and their usages of symbolism, imagery, and poetry. Once we can understand those things and what they're trying to do with them, it makes their message easier to understand. Secondly, he advocates having the spirit of prophecy. Of course, having the Holy Ghost with us makes anything and everything easier to understand. So definitely avoiding certain behaviors that we know will drive away the Spirit will help us there. Third, he advocates understanding the things of the Jews, particularly the culture and the context of those times. We have to understand the situation Isaiah was in there in the 8th century, right before the destruction of the northern kingdom, etc. Those things become very important to us. But also he advocates living in the time when the prophecies will be fulfilled as something that can help us understand these things. And to some of us, that's like, well, we can't really choose that, can we? But it's also very important to recognize that many of the things that Isaiah prophesies of are meant to have multiple fulfillments. So he talks about some things that are occurring right there when he's talking about them, but also with the understanding that they have parallels or multiple fulfillments in future times, meaning during the mortal ministry of Jesus, or even latter-day fulfillment. And reading with the Spirit can help us in these things. Now, Martin also discussed a little bit about the scholarly approaches to Isaiah. And there are 2 general approaches. He mentioned that scholars generally divide the text up into 3 different portions. This would be what is called the diachronic approach. This is the approach that looks at the text and tries to figure out how it developed over time. Somewhat opposite that is what is called the synchronic approach, which looks at the text as a whole, trying to figure out what the whole message is of the final version of the text. Now, as the church and as church members, particularly in Sunday school, if we are getting beyond just looking at very specific verses, we generally tend to take this synchronic approach, which can be a very, very good thing. Scholars, on the other hand, tend to view it more diachronically, but there are shifts ongoing, as Martin has mentioned. Both views have important things to help us understand Isaiah, and from somewhat of an intellectual point of view, we should not necessarily prioritize one over the other. But largely speaking synchronically, then, Isaiah has some very interesting things. Specifically, most all scholars note that somewhere around chapter 39 there's a major shift in what is going on in the book of Isaiah. The first half largely deals with a lot of oracles and judgments and prophecies of destruction and things to come that Isaiah is prophesying against different nations, particularly Israel and Judah, but also Assyria and Babylon and these kinds of things. But at this shift then, starting in chapter 40, where we're starting today, begins a different kind of portion of Isaiah. Now, one synchronic breakdown of the book of Isaiah that I've seen that I kind of like in this regard calls this portion what Isaiah's book of comfort, that starts in chapter 40, verse 1, where he's shifted away from these earlier forms of judgment to coming to emphasize how the Lord will reveal his universal sovereignty, his powers over history itself and over everything else, and expressions of restoration, mercy, love, and especially the ideas of the suffering servant and the servant's song that we're going to talk about in a little bit. This becomes very important for our consideration as we look at these verses, especially those that the Gospel Doctrine Manual points out as those pointing to Jesus Christ, because it becomes apparent when you're looking at the book of Isaiah in that kind of broad context that he is talking largely about this scattering and these judgments that are going to be upon the people, but always casting this then in the hope that comes in the second half with the restoration, the love, the mercy, all of these things, especially those that are found in the person of our Lord Jesus Christ and what he can do for us. So, with that somewhat more general introduction, Bruce, you had some other general observations from the beginning of this, and then we'll get into some more specifics.
Yeah, one I'd like to bring up, which actually I was in the roundtable last week, and I brought this up as well. In my own efforts in my own wrestlings with Isaiah, and particularly in trying to teach it in Gospel Doctrine, I found that a useful analogy has to do with holograms. A holographic image printed on a piece of paper. If you take a regular picture and you cut it into 4 pieces, you have the 4 quarters of the picture. Take a holographic image and you cut it into 4 pieces, and then shine the laser on each of the 4 pieces, you have the whole picture, just at lower resolution. And you can keep doing that to a smaller and smaller level. And I think part of why a lot of members struggle with Isaiah is he seems to be saying the same thing over and over again. And to a certain extent he is. You can take the whole theme of Isaiah as an entire book of God's judgment and mercy upon Israel and judgment upon the world, and then you can see sections of chapters that cover that, and then you can see individual chapters that recapitulate all those themes in a single chapter, and then you'll hit 3 or 4 verses that basically recapitulate that entire theme in 3 or 4 verses. And I think the purpose of that is to basically help drive it home. It's trying to get the images and the words to stick with us and to realize how important this is and what God's. I mean, at the very end, I think Isaiah is largely about God's relationship with us and how He deals with us. And the other thing I was going to bring up, because this struck me while reading these chapters in particular, is that there is a persistent theme through most of these chapters of God, or Isaiah talking about God, trying to get across how truly majestic He is. I was struggling to come up with the word I was looking for. Cosmic sounds to something or other. But you have God talking about the scope of His power, of His knowledge, of His existence, and He keeps contrasting that basically with 2 things, with us as fallible humans, and in particular with dumb idols. And he has this overall theme of, look, I created the stars. I existed before all this. I created this earth on which you stand. You know, I have this power. I created you, and you're building these idols out of metal and wood and worshiping them. What's wrong with you? How can you do this? This is so short-sighted, and it's a consistent theme, right? There's just only, I think, about 2 of these chapters that really don't touch on that at some point. That contrast between God's majesty and His power and His omnipotence, His omniscience, and so on, and the struggles of men, and particularly the foolishness of creating idols out of your hands, out of metal or wood, as he puts it at one point. You try to find wood that's not yet rotten, and then you shape it to build an idol. It's kind of like, what's wrong with you guys?
Yeah.
It's right here. The earth is well, anyway, that's a theme for you teachers when you're covering all these chapters. Look at how often it comes up in each of these chapters.
Yeah, and I think one of the good words you're looking for is maybe just incomparability.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. That's actually probably the word I'm looking for.
I mean, you mix that with cosmic, and that's what we have with God. Omnipotent, omniscient, and there's nothing that really compares to Him, kind of thing.
And yet loving through all that. And that's
Yes.
as you mentioned, is one of the other messages.
And that then becomes the interesting turn that God is speaking to us as fallen man, and at the same time that He's saying you guys are just so stupid with these idols and these problems, and yet He turns around and He says, "But I love you, and I am so interested in you, and you are everything to me, and I will welcome you back at any time that you want to come back." It becomes a very powerful message. Okay, well, let's jump then into a little bit of the specifics. Shon, you have yet to speak, so maybe if we can have you share some thoughts of yours from chapter 40. We'll just start and work through a few of the chapters.
I'll do it, and I'm glad I get to speak now because I wanted to just sort of tag on with Bruce, and this will lead us into 40 as well. Sometimes I think this concept of worshiping false idols just seems pretty foreign to us. And by the way, Bruce was talking from things that he does all over the place, but particularly in chapter 44, verses 14 through 20. I was just looking to see where that was. There's some really humorous stuff from Isaiah that Bruce was just giving you. Well, what are you doing? You worship this thing that you've made for yourself. You take leftover wood and you burn it, and you say, "Hey, I'm warm because of this way." He's got a lot of funny riffs, sort of, that he does there. I like seeing Isaiah's sense of humor. And then I'll show you here in chapter 40. You get really this beautiful overview of who God is in what I like to call the 4 omnis. I may have made one of these up, but omnipotence, His omniscience, omnipresence, and sometimes as Latter-day Saints we are unnecessarily uncomfortable with His omnipresence, but of course because of the light of Christ, God's influence is all places, but not just in space, but also in time. And then His omnibenevolence. That may be a new word, I'm not sure. But that's important, and Joseph Smith actually spends time in Lectures on Faith, or the author of Lectures on Faith spends time saying, in order to exercise faith to salvation, you've got to have an idea of these attributes of God, that God is all-powerful, that He knows all things. Otherwise, you're going to think, well, somebody else is going to come along smarter than God, and the whole plan's going to be overturned. But you've also got to know that He's all-loving. Wonderful to have this all-powerful, all-knowing God, but it doesn't help a whole lot unless you know that He cares about you. And so let me just give you the verses, just in case you want to do this with your classes. Omnipotence, and you could divide these out in different ways in chapter 40. I would say verses 12, 15 through 17, 22 through 25, and 28. Omnipresence, 13 through 14, 26, and 28. And that includes the fact that He's eternal. Let's see. Oh, that's omniscient. Sorry, 13 through 14, 26, and 28. Omnipresent, 6 through 8, and 28. And then I think most powerfully, most beautifully in chapter 40, His omnibenevolence, verses 1 through 2, 9 through 11, and verse 29. And there's just some beautiful
things there. Verse 29, he giveth power to the faint, to them that have no might he increaseth strength. But back to this idea, he's working against people who are worshiping idols, and we think, okay, well, I guess my money is my idol, so we've sort of applied this in our modern day. But I still think for many of us it seems rather distant. I realized at some point that really what we do, we are very adept at putting other things or other beings into God's place in our life. Our relationship with God is that which should provide our lives with a sense of meaning, which should say to us, you have value as an individual because of who you are in relationship to God, because of who God is, and he loves you. That provides our lives with purpose and a sense of meaning. But we look for other things to make it all better at the end of the day. And so, and you can see when you're doing it, it becomes very unhealthy. There are healthy ways to do this where God's still at the top and we use some of the tools we have, but some people will use alcohol to make it all okay, to say, hey, this is all right. I have a tendency when I'm at the lower ends of my life to use sitcoms on TV, comedies, because I watch those at the end of the day and I think, well, I am much smarter than that guy. Everything's, and I laugh and I feel better. And then that's okay, right? Unless that becomes something. Sleep can be one of these things. But even our mortal relationships, I think we get ourselves in real danger when we have a sibling or even a mother or a father that we say, it's your job to make me feel like I have value. Now, it is our parents' jobs to do their best at being good to us, but when we expect those things from those mortals, we have created idols out of them. If you or I expect our spouses to make us feel good about ourselves, to make it all okay at the end of the day, to fill our needs, and if they fail us, then something is terribly wrong. We've made an idol out of them, a false god out of them, and we are going to be terribly disappointed because they're mortal and they will fail us. They're not perfect. God is the only one that's perfect, and we cause huge issues in our relationships and in our lives by placing other people in this position where they are supposed to be God to us. And so I didn't mean to go off so long on that, but I think some of what Isaiah is doing really is, we're pretty bad at this, actually. We do put other things often in the role of our relationship with God and what it should be. So
yeah,
thanks for that opportunity.
Some interesting thoughts. Now, Martin, you had some other things to talk about in chapter 40. You had some...
Yeah, a couple of quick thoughts. The first one is sort of introductory. I know a lot of people struggle with Isaiah, and rather than talk about different specific kinds of poetic style, if you just realize that from a poetic standpoint, Isaiah and many other prophets will express the same idea two different ways. And we see this a lot at the very beginning of Isaiah chapter 40. And don't let that throw you off. That's just a way of emphasizing things, the way that often happened to me when I was a little kid, when my mom would say you're grounded, and not only that, you're in a lot of trouble too. You say the same thing twice for emphasis. Isaiah does the same kind of a thing for the Jews here. Another thing that you shouldn't be thrown off by is something that Andrew touched on, and that was there are multiple ways that Isaiah can be read and understood. It's a little bit like that great philosopher, historian, and theologian Spike Lee said, history never repeats itself, but man, it sure looks the same a lot of the time. Sorry, I couldn't help it. And if you take a look at chapter 40, and somebody says, "Oh, this is talking about Christ's appearance the first time, and about John the Baptist declaring that he will come forward," well, maybe that's exactly right. If somebody else says, "God, this is talking about the second coming of Christ," maybe they're right too. There are many, many places in Isaiah where people, very, very bright people, far, far brighter than I will ever hope to be, who find 2, 3, sometimes as many as 5 different fulfillments for a specific reference that Isaiah has. And I've already mentioned the first part where it talks about his coming. The other place that I'll just mention very, very briefly, excuse me, is starting in verse 22, where it talks about the Lord, and that he is the one who sits on his throne above the earth, beyond the sky, and it gives the metaphor, the analogy, that it's like people looking down on ants, and he has this sky that's stretched out like a curtain, and it's used as his tent. These are metaphors that worked really, really well for the people of that time. They may not work quite as well for us, but they do describe very much his omniscience and his great power and glory. Another interesting part in verse 22 is that where it's translated is that he the Lord is the one. That is actually one of these sort of subtle translations where it's talking about he is a man, he is a person. And without getting into the details there are many places in the Old Testament, including Isaiah chapter 40 verse 22, where God is described as a heavenly man, but the translators can't quite make themselves, because it sounds a little bit sacrilegious, but to Latter-day Saints it sounds great. It makes us seem a little bit closer to him. I'll turn it back to you, Andrew.
Yeah, no, some interesting ideas there with anthropomorphic descriptions of God as presenting him in a way or similar shape to man and mankind. And there's a couple things that we could talk about here. Bruce, you had something about footstools.
Well, actually, that ties right back to the passage Martin was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
You have this concept of God's footstool. The earth is God's footstool, which is actually all the way in 3rd Isaiah in 66. But there's a concept that shows up in Psalms and in Chronicles that when the Israelites go to worship at the temple, and specifically at the Ark of the Covenant, that is God's footstool. We refer to it as the mercy seat, but that's where his feet rest, and he extends on up into heaven, and he's looking down, just as Martin described, and seeing the inhabitants below. Not that he's envisioned by a giant, but you're back to this incomprehensible, or I'm sorry, what was the word used? Incomparable, thank you. Possibly incomprehensible as well, but this incomparable nature of God, that he can come down, that his feet will touch the Ark of the Covenant, even as he reigns in heaven, and he looks down on us, as Joseph Smith said, with all the affections of a loving parent, which is what shows up in here again. One other follow-up, Martin, to what you said. My background is software engineering and architecture, and one of the revolutions in the field over the past 30 years has been the concept of patterns that actually derived from Christopher Alexander in architecture, and this concept of a pattern language. But these are patterns that occur not just in actual source code, but patterns in development efforts, patterns of behavior. I did a book on basically anti-patterns in software development. And a lot of what we have, particularly in Isaiah, and this gets back to how things get applied again and again, and the core of Nephi's famous "I did liken the scriptures unto ourselves," is that a lot of what we get in the scriptures are patterns simply because these are the things that people do over and over again. One of my specialties is why large-scale IT projects fail. And the real sad part is I can go back to 2 books published 40 years ago and basically point to everything in there and say this is why the projects fail. It's been well known. It's been well documented, for 40 years. In fact, I've referred to one of the books as the Bible of information technology because everyone knows about it and no one ever follows it. And it's the same thing. you tend to get this often this intellectual dismissive, particularly among members of the church, of, oh, those are the primary answers, or those are the Sunday school answers. Well, they're the answers because they are the things that actually work, that make a difference. And much of what we have in the Scriptures, including Isaiah, is this pleading from God and from Isaiah, saying, this is so simple, guys. This is all you need to do, and I will bless you. Why do you keep rejecting me? And it's why you have these multiple valid interpretations of passages, because the same patterns occur over and over again and have through human history. Anyway, 2 cents there.
No, some important thoughts to think about. Before we leave the idea of anthropomorphism, though, Shon, you had some things on the right hand that Isaiah uses quite a few different times, particularly in chapter 41.
Yeah, this is really fascinating, I think, for us. You can imagine that. Think of a blessing of a baby where you've got a large circle around that baby, and the right hand, there's preference shown for that right hand. I would never want to indicate something that I don't believe in, that is that we have to use the right hand when we take the sacrament or something like that. But there is clearly a symbolic importance given to the right hand, and it's pretty clear here in Isaiah. And let me just find some of those verses here. So if you look at Isaiah 41:10, and it's a favorite one because we sing it as hymn 85 all the time. Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee, I will help thee, yea, I will uphold thee with, not just with the hand of my righteousness, but with the right hand of my righteousness. Now that right hand, I think many of you know this, but it was the clean hand, anciently speaking, the hand that was reserved for eating, rather than the left hand, which was reserved for non-eating, bathroom functions and things like that, right? And so not only was it the hand that's reserved for eating, of course, this is the hand that you would touch others with, that you would shake hands with, that you would enter into covenants with, you would write or inscribe your name with the right hand typically. And so very few left-handers, and although they did exist, but it would appear that many of them were trained to use their right hand. And this was the symbolic covenant hand of the ancient Near East. You've got a couple of other really nice references to the right hand. Verse 13, he does it again. I, the Lord thy God, this is still Isaiah 41, will hold thy right hand. So think of that image of God stretching out his right hand and grasping you by the hand, and he's going to save you with that hand grasp, and he's going to say, fear not, I'm going to help you. There are covenant implications there. One more, chapter 42, verse 6. I, the Lord, have called thee in righteousness. I will hold thine hand and will keep thee and give thee for a covenant, right? And so a king or a ruler comes and is going to enter into a covenant relationship with someone, and there are lots of things that could be done to show that. And you'd inscribe your name to a decree, potentially. There would be a hand grasp, something like that. But it is an act of mercy for that king or God here to reach forth his hand. Of course, if it's God, then we can't see God, and so he's going to have to reach through the veil that covers our understanding, grasp us and hold us up and bring us into a relationship with him. And Isaiah is doing all of that in poetic and beautiful ways, I believe. So,
yeah, it has a lot of echoes and whatnot through. I mean, Bruce brought up architecture. I can think of a number of architectural features, both in our temples, especially the early ones of this dispensation, but also many other Christian and Jewish architectural features that depict this, with a hand coming out of clouds that will save us, that will grab us, that will hold us and help us come through these things. It becomes a very interesting motif.
Andrew, sorry about that, but you've got Book of Mormon. You've got them being lifted up. They're in an unconscious state there in the story of Lamoni, and then lifted up, grabbed by the right hand. You've got this in the New Testament with the lame man who there at the temple as Peter grabs him. And if you think we don't really do it with any kind of a hand clasp, but think of the priesthood bearer lifting up the one being baptized out of the waters of death, baptismal waters, into a new life. There's new life there. There's a new relationship. There's a covenant relationship.
Yeah, it's a pattern that gets played out quite a lot in a lot of different places, and especially in LDS ritual participation, both from baptism on to other things. So, well, we only have a few minutes left, so let's move on a little bit. I think we would be remiss if we didn't at least mention the servant songs. Maybe, Shon, if you have a few more things to say there, just as an introductory to what we mean about Isaiah and the suffering servant.
Yeah, we've got 7. It depends on who you are, but there are 7 servant songs, most would say. 42, 49, 50, 52, 53 are some of those spots. But these often then are what we would describe as Isaiah speaking messianically. And they're very hard for us to understand. Well, who's talking here? Is Isaiah talking here? Is the Lord talking here? And it switches person, and it seems so confusing. And there's a lot of different ways to understand this, but I prefer to emphasize the song-like nature of this poetry. My daughters like Taylor Swift right now, and Taylor Swift can write a song and sing a song about breaking up with someone, and she's never going to get back together. Some of you are familiar with this, some of you have no idea what I'm talking about. She's never going to get back together, like, ever, right? This is never going to happen. Now, I would assume whoever wrote that song had someone in mind. I would assume Taylor Swift has someone in mind. My girls sing along with it. I don't know that they've got anybody they're thinking of specifically. They just like the overall emotion. They're thinking of this, being, I don't know, this hypothetical person. And I think that might be helpful with, if you think of a love song, we sing along with it. Sometimes the person singing even mentions a name that has nothing to do with anything we care about, but we put in that love song the person that we think of, and it has meaning to us. So who do these songs apply to? Well, most powerfully, they apply to the epitome of all of these divine relationships. They apply to Christ, and they do prophesy powerfully of Christ. But I think we miss something if we don't remember Christ. His model is there to show us who we are to be, who prophets are to be, what Isaiah's experience was, what my experience will be to a certain degree. And so it's Jews interpret these as, well, this is us. This is the Jewish people. The suffering one is us as a people. They're not wrong. I think most beautifully these refer to Christ, but to the Messiah. But these refer to all Israelites because Christ is the great example of what our lives will be. We will go through deep trials, and we will be rescued from those trials because one has done it before us. Christ has descended below all things and has risen above all things, and he will allow us to do the same. So I don't know if that's helpful or not, but a few thoughts.
No, that's a great introduction. We sadly are not going to have the time to delve into each of the servant songs, but that's a good introduction to help people gain some sort of understanding that when they get to those chapters and looking at what they mean and how to interpret them, it's a good place to start. Now, in our last few minutes, I think we're going to jump forward a little bit. Martin, you wanted to talk a little bit about chapter 49 with some of the restoration and the concern for Jerusalem there.
I would be happy to do that. This is one of the sections where you obviously have multiple fulfillments, but we specifically as Latter-day Saints look towards the modern-day restoration of Israel. Remember quite a few years ago in a Gospel Doctrine class when I was talking about several times when the Jews were restored back to the area around Palestine, somebody raised their hand and said, so how many times has there been a scattering and a restoration of the Jews? And I scratched my head and said, that's a great question. I don't know, but I'm going to try to find out. And I think it was 9 that I counted up at the time, and there are probably several that I missed. This is something that has repeated itself throughout history. But in chapter 49, we have these wonderful statements about a restoration, starting in verse 8 and moving on, that describe a wonderful time in the future. And they also describe very distinctly how much God has His people in mind. Earlier on in our verses today in chapter 41, verses 8 and 9, it says that Israel will be brought out from the various nations of the earth. These aren't just Jews. These are people who come from all over the place. And in the latter days, God will restore Israel. And we have some of the most beautiful language. It just, on occasion, brings me to tears. It's so beautiful in chapter 49, verse 16, where God says that He will never forget Jerusalem. He will never forget Jerusalem. And we have this statement that He says, I have written your name in the palms of my hands, which is reminiscent of some of the language that we have in 1 Nephi, chapter 21, verses 14 through 16. There was apparently an ancient tradition that some Jewish mothers and others had where they would have tattooed or written in their palms the names of their children, so that they would always remember them in all of their tasks and all of their duties, which of course were many. And God here is saying, the Lord is saying, that He will never forget us, the same way that a Jewish mother would never ever forget her children. That to me is absolutely beautiful.
Yeah, it's a great one to end on. Behold, I have graven thee upon the palms of my hands. That's the verbiage that we're more likely to remember, because that's what the KJV has, and that's what's in the Book of Mormon. That the Lord, in very specific ways, He holds the scars on His hands that will always be there for us. It becomes an important aspect for us. I just am looking at one last verse that I guess we'll end on this one, verse 13 there of verse 40 of chapter 49, and this again is a great example of the poetry, the parallelism that Isaiah uses, but also a great end to this comforting theme. Sing, O heavens, and be joyful, O earth, and break forth into singing, O mountains. For the Lord hath comforted His people, and will have mercy upon His afflicted. He's there for us, no matter what afflictions we go through. He's there for all of us, and that's our latter-day context application. These verses definitely had meaning for Isaiah in his time and anyone else in their times, but they are important verses for us to consider and to learn from. So, if nobody else has anything else to say, we'll go ahead and wrap up there. Thank you for being with us. We invite you to join us for further roundtables, as well as any other written materials that we have to share with you at mormoninterpreter.com. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much.